The easiest way to address a piriformis with a lacrosse ball is to just sit on top of the lacrosse ball. It's going to be just outside of your sacrum. It'll be in the area where you're relatively tender, the lateral side of the glutes, essentially. Once you find it, you're going to bend your knee, rest your ankle on top of the knee on the other side, and you're just going to roll over that tender area front to back, and then you can shift side to side with that. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have a tendency to want to hold your breath. We know that's going to happen. Don't hold your breath. It'll actually just make it worse. If you find a spot that's tender, concentrate on slowly exhaling through that. As you get going with this, you can get a little creative. You can start mixing that front to back rotation. You can mix it side to side. You can do circles over that. Whatever you need to do until this starts to feel a little bit better. As you can see here, I'm specifically internally, externally rotating that hip. We can move a little bit more laterally over that. You can even drop down onto an elbow and open those shoulders to get even more on the outside of that piriformis. Regardless of how you're on that piriformis, again, we're just going to shift back and forth, side to side, internally, externally rotate that hip as needed. We do want to very specifically go in and address the tissues of our high hamstrings, right where the hamstrings come into that sits bone, that ischial tuberosity. To do this, you're going to need something where you can stand up and create quite a bit of pressure into that high hamstring, into that ischial tuberosity. Here I'm using a safety catch on the bar or on the rack. You can use the top of a chair, the back of a couch. If you have a barbell in a rack, you can use that. And what you're going to do, once you find that, you're going to lean into that. It's going to be uncomfortable. Just like anything uncomfortable with this, we're not going to hold our breath. We want to slowly exhale through that. You can flex and extend the knee. You can rotate the hip. You can move back and forth. What we're trying to do is trying to create some shearing of that tissue underneath that pressure. Again, it's going to be uncomfortable. Make sure we're not holding our breath and we're exhaling through this to get the most benefit out of it. As we move into some actual traditional stretches, we're going to very specifically target the high hamstrings. To do this, you want to pull your knee all the way up to your chest. You're trying to use your arms to pull that hip into as much flexion as possible. Once you get there, you're then going to extend your knee. As you extend the knee, don't let that hip drop down lower than where it's currently at. You want to maintain that high degree of hip flexion while you're extending that knee. Now, as you extend that knee, what you're going to do, you're going to cycle a big breath in, and then you're going to exhale nice and slowly, and then you're going to come out of that stretch. So every time we go into that stretch, we're going to cycle a big breath in, and we're going to slowly exhale that out. To get into our sprinter stretch, we're going to be down on one knee, almost like we're going to take off sprinting. That's how it gets its name. Focus here is on the front leg. We're going to keep our hands on the ground. We're going to keep our entire front foot flat on the ground. Back foot, you can stay up on your toes. And what we're going to do is we're going to lift our hips up as high as we can, cycle a breath in, let it out, and then come back down. With this, we're trying to get our hips as high as we can and fully extend our knee as much as we can. As we get into our quadruped hip series, we're going to start out with our hands directly underneath our shoulders, our knees directly underneath our hips. For this first one, we're going to keep our foot resting gently on the ground, and all we're doing is extending that knee. Once the knee is extended, we're going to stop. You're going to have to pick your leg up just enough to where you can slide that foot, but the foot does need to be resting on the ground. The second part of this, once we have fully extended that knee, we're then going to lift that foot up. We're not trying to lift as high as possible. As soon as your foot comes off the ground, that's high enough. Don't worry about trying to get that foot as high off the ground as you can. Just break the plane of the ground and we're good to go. Third part of this, we're going to lift that leg off the ground, keep the knee straight, and we're going to make circles clockwise, counterclockwise. If you make 10 clockwise, make 10 counterclockwise. If you do 5 clockwise, do 5 counterclockwise. Just make sure that we're keeping it equal between counterclockwise and clockwise. The next part of this series, we're going to lift that leg up, and now we're just going to internally and externally rotate our hip. This motion should be coming from the hip. We're trying to turn that foot out as far as we can, turn that foot in as far as we can. while trying to keep the rest of the body as still as possible. After that, we're going to extend that knee, lift the foot, and now we're making little 6 to 12-inch circles with our leg. Easiest visualization with this is that you have a pencil extending out through the bottom of your heel and you're trying to draw circles on the wall behind you. Try to be as smooth as possible. Try to keep this coming from as much within the hip joint as possible. Keep that knee extended the whole time as well. After this, we're going to try and make as big of motions as we can with our hip, and now we're going to try and coordinate what's going on with the knee as well. So we're going to extend that leg out behind us, and then we're dragging that knee up into the outside, almost trying to touch the outside of our elbow before we come back down into that quadruped position. The last thing we're going to do out of quadruped is the exact same thing, only the exact opposite. We're going to drag our knee up to our elbow, and then we're going to rotate our hip out to the side before we extend our knee. Again, try to be as smooth as possible. Try to get that knee fully extended when it's out behind us, while that knee is fully extended as well. As you're going through these, you're going to notice that there's going to be a tendency for everything in the body to want to move. We want to try and isolate this to the hip as much as we can. If you're a real glutton for punishment, you can do the exact same thing we just did with your foot out at about 45 degrees. Here we're just going to do the leg lift, but we could go through the ankle circles, the hip circles, and everything else as well. We can now get into half kneeling, and we're going to work on some very specific hip mobility work. Here we're really focusing on that right hip. Both hands are going to be flat on the ground in line with your front foot, and you want to make sure that the outside of your front hand is touching your ankle and your front elbow is touching the inside of that knee. We're going to start shifting our weight front and back. Then we're going to drop down to where our outside elbow is down on the ground. And we're going to just continue to shift our weight forward and back with this. As we do, it's going to be uncomfortable, but like always, when we find that period of discomfort, exhale through that. Eventually, we want to try and drop both of our elbows down to the ground. We can shift forward and back. We can shift side to side. We're trying to get into as much hip flexion as we can. While this might be a big stretch on the front side, on the front leg in our glute area, on that left leg, you're going to notice this in the front side of that hip. If you notice a front foot starting to pop up, leverage your elbow, leverage your foot so that you maintain that front foot engaged fully with the ground the whole time. Don't forget to breathe. We're now going to get into a supine posture where our feet are up on the wall. We can have your feet on the back of the couch. You can have your feet up on anything as long as they're elevated up above. We want your hips in as much hip flexion as you can get with your tailbone resting on the ground. When we get here, I just want you to start out nice, big, slow belly breaths. You notice my belly's rising as far as we can, and then it's followed by a nice, slow exhale. After we've taken a few inhale exhales, now what we're going to do with our foot still resting on the wall, we're just going to plantar flex, dorsiflex our ankle. Nothing too complicated. The wall's providing the support. We're just going to flex the ankle. Then we're going to internally, externally rotate the hip. Again, the wall, or in this case the rack, is supporting my leg. I'm just trying to internally, externally rotate, plantar flex, dorsiflex that ankle. In line with the rest of our lower body series, we can then do circles clockwise, counterclockwise. And again, the wall is keeping that leg where it needs to be, so we can really focus on the motion at the ankle and creating the tissue change that we're needing to create with this. The next part of this, we're going to lift our leg off the wall and cycle a big breath in, big breath out, again, drawing the air down into our belly. Try to keep that knee as straight as possible, and we're lifting that leg only as far as our flexibility will allow us to go with an extended knee. Once we've done that, we're going to go back to the same sequence of things we've done before. We're going to keep that knee extended, foot off the wall, and we're going to plantar flex, dorsiflex the ankle. In between each of these, if you need to let your foot rest on the wall, that's perfectly fine. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to flex our hip to the extent of our range of motion, keep that knee extended, and we're going to internally, externally rotate the entire hip. Try to keep the rest of the body and your opposite hip nice and still. We can then go into our clockwise, counterclockwise circles of the entire lower leg. Again, imagine there's a pencil coming out of the bottom of your heel. And again, don't hold your breath. With our banded external hip rotation, what we're going to do, we're going to be standing with knee and hip flexed about 90 degrees and a band anchored on the outside of your ankle where you're having to force your hip into external rotation with some resistance. The goal of this isn't to strengthen the lateral hip. What we're trying to do is we're trying to utilize movement, a very focused and isolated movement with a little bit of resistance to drive an increase of blood flow through that muscle pumping action. So try to focus in on the hip. We want lots of reps with this, but just to get that blood flowing. For our leg swings, we're going to hold on to something for balance as much as we need to, and you're just making as big of a motion front to back as you can with that right hip. Now, you're going to think that this is all about the front hip. We want the focus to be on that left hip, the hip that's staying on the ground. So swing that leg as much as you want. Try to use your support as little as you need to, but as much as you need to, and try to keep that opposite hip still. We can then go into side-to-side swings. Again, I don't really care what you're doing with that swing leg because that's not the focus. We want the focus to be on the leg that's on the ground. If you can progress to where you're using as minimal support as possible with your hands, that's wonderful. We can get kind of sloppy with the movement of that swing because, again, it's all about what's going on the stance leg, not the swing leg. We're going to get into some single leg deadlifting, but we're going to do it without weight. We're going to start with both feet on the ground, both hands on the box or on a kettlebell that allows us to get into a good position. And then we're going to start extending the opposite leg back. So here I'm extending my right leg back. Once it's extended, I'm then just going to stand up nice and tall. Both feet come down to the ground. Both hands come down to the box. I extend my right leg, and then I stand up. The focus here is on that left leg. So extend that hip, stand up, come down to the support of the box or whatever you need to. The box, the kettlebell can be at whatever height you need, but we do need you to come down to where both feet and both hands are nice and stable on something. We don't want this to be a balance exercise. We want you to be nice and controlled as you extend that hip, take your hands off the support, and then stand. For our standing hip rotations, it's good to have the box or support for a starting point. Here you can see I'm using my offhand on the rack for some more balance. But now what we're doing, we're extending that right leg, and all I'm trying to do is open my hips, open my pelvis up towards the ceiling, and then bring it back down to my hands on the box. We're going back and forth with this. The focus is on that left hip. Probably going to feel a little bit of a burn with this one.